Kareem, thanks so much for doing this. It's taken over 200 uh, episodes, more than that, to get you back on. Thank you for number one, and thank you for this one, um, and not just for coming on, but because of what we hopefully will be able to talk about today. One of the things that I've really enjoyed personally is learning throughout the past 5-6 years, talking with different people about different things. Most of the time, I'm talking to people about themselves. Very few and far between, but some of my favorite conversations are when I talk to people about bigger themes, bigger things going on in the world. And that's why you and I are chatting today. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to learn more about what's happening, what has happened, and what we're hoping to have happen in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem. So again, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was proud to be number one, and I'm proud to be whatever 200 and whatever this ends up being. It's a big deal. Yeah, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah. So your family, I knew I think I knew that your dad was from there, uh, but I did not know you still have family living in parts of Israel. Like, where exactly is your father from, and where do you still have family members?
Yeah, so my father was born in Jerusalem, Palestine, and when he was
Okay.
born, it was Palestine.
Yeah.
And I still have relatives in Jerusalem, and then in Bethlehem as well, and the surrounding areas there.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been able and fortunate to have visited them and spend, I've never lived in Palestine or Israel, but I've spent quite a bit of time there.
Yeah.
I've been back for trips and with my family and on my own, and I've brought my wife there and I've brought friends there, and so
Wow.
yeah, it's a place that I've spent some time in without ever living there, but I've spent quite a bit of time there and have a lot of connections and roots to that area.
Yeah. Your dad was born in Jerusalem, Palestine, before it was Israel.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me, I don't know if yeah, I'm sure he's told you stories, told you some family history. Wondering if he can sort of, as far as as you can recollect, a bit about your dad's family.
Yeah. My family on that side is extremely close, and the stories were shared all the time. We're, when when you're Palestinian and you've been kind of spread out throughout the world, you're very proud of that, and you find a lot of it's very special to be still connected to that area for sure. So my family, my dad's family was living just outside of the old city of Jerusalem, right outside of Damascus Gate, which is one of the most famous gates of the old city. The old city is surrounded by walls. And my grandma, or yeah, my teta and my Sidi, who I lived with, and with the seven my seven uncles and aunts in just outside of the old city in Jerusalem during the war that in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War, after Israel was founded. There was significant fighting about the two-state solution that the UN had kind of created.
Yeah.
When Israel was formed on that land specifically. And my grandfather, so my dad's father, was killed in the middle of that fighting. He wasn't in the military. He wasn't fighting. He was shot by one of the sides. No one's really sure of which side he was shot by. And so my family had to bury him in Jerusalem in the middle of a war zone, and then they fled to be with my teta, my grandma's family, just outside of Bethlehem.
Mhm.
And at that time she had an infant, brand new baby girl who unfortunately didn't survive from other complications later on. But then the rest of my uncles and aunts were kind of spread out into different orphanages and living with different families in the area, while my grandma finished her nursing school and became a nurse to support the family.
What? You consider yourself Palestinian?
Yeah, I do. It's a strange combination. I identify quite deeply with that side of my family, just as much as I do with my mom's side, which is she was born in Austria and Germany, and so I with my name.
She's born in Austria.
My mom was born in Austria during World War II. Yeah, okay. in a refugee camp. Yeah. But that's a whole other story. Other story on that side of the family.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, I do. I consider myself Palestinian. It's even though I have never lived there, I have a lot of connection to the land. I mean, again, still have family there. It's been something that's been a prominent part of my life growing up. Mm-hmm. You know, I was my dad has spent quite a bit of time there and was involved politically in the Palestinian freedom movements throughout the years. It's really shaped his life, as well as that effect on me and my family's life as well.
He's not there anymore.
No, he lives just outside of Washington, D.C. Okay. Yeah, his story is pretty intense. During the first Intifada in the late 80s.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
So Intifada means uprising. It was a Palestinian movement against the occupation, against the Israeli occupation. So again, to go back further, after the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, Israel was formed, and Jordan occupied the West Bank, which is now with the West Bank. So part of Jerusalem and the West Bank it's the West Bank of the Jordan River is why it's called the West Bank. Okay. And that included East Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Nablus and Ramallah and Hebron and what's now considered the West Bank. And Egypt occupied Gaza.
Okay.
Then there was never a very good peace there. It was never good. And then in 1967 there was the 6-Day War, and during that war Israel took over all of it and occupied the West Bank and occupied Gaza and took over the entire area, which is now called Israel. Okay. And that's when that version of the occupation really took over, because Israel now had control over all of the Palestinian territories.
Can you tell me, so before World War II, that area was known as Palestine.
Yeah, it was under British control.
British control.
The British mandated Palestine.
And then at the end or after World War II, the world essentially is looking for a home for the Jewish people, correct?
Yeah.
And so what was it? In short, Britain raised their hand and said, "Hey, we got some land out here."
No. The UN as a group declared that they created the Partition Plan, is one way it was called. Okay. Which would split the land up.
Okay.
And Britain didn't actually agree with it. They refused to implement the plan, and essentially just said, "Okay, we're done here." Washed their hands of it and left.
Okay.
Which was there was a whole bunch of activity before that.
Okay.
Jewish terrorists, Arab terrorists, it was a mess. In some areas, not all areas, just some areas.
Jews are living in the area. Arabs are living in the area.
Yeah.
It's the land is known as Palestine, though.
It was Palestine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
And then when the state of Israel was created, that's when the Arab League, so it wasn't called Jordan at the time, it was like Transjordan or something, and Egypt and the rest of the Arab League, which is all disheveled. It's not the same Arab states as they are now. They fought over the land. They wanted control. They fought in the absence of the British mandate. They fought over it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So your dad is born in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
In the land then known as Palestine.
Palestine.
Becomes Israel.
Yep. He's
Your
still
dad
living
is
there.
Still there.
Yeah.
Okay.
He stayed there. Yeah, he stayed there up until he lived in Jordan for a little bit.
Okay.
And then went to the US for university to get a college degree.
Okay.
So spent some time in the US, went back and forth, and then ended up doing his doctorate in child psychology here in the United States.
Oh, wow. And
lived here until 1981. I think he moved back to Palestine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then when he moved back, I was still living in Ohio at the time. And when he moved back, he started the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence.
Oh, wow.
And so he started an organization to share the nonviolent works of Martin Luther King Jr., of Gandhi, of the resistance movements around the world focused on nonviolence to resist the Israeli occupation.
Okay.
One of his main focuses, just as it was when he was living in the States, was on the children, and really working for ways to protect the children from the violence that was happening around them.
Oh, wow.
And the way to do that is through nonviolence, is by not focusing on the violence.
Yeah.
And through that, he was very involved with back to the Intifada, the uprising is what it was called.
Yeah.
And so there were a few major factions, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was run by Yasser Arafat, and had a military wing attached to it. They were always fighting for Israel, and this is one of the worst parts about all of this is their mentality was to destroy Israel. Okay. That the only way that Palestine could be free is if Israel was destroyed. Okay. And that's ridiculous. That flat out is just wrong. Flat out.
Why is that?
Whenever the two wrongs don't make a right, Israel was created and it was done so poorly. The Zionist mantra. So Zionism is the idea that this is the Israeli homeland, and that all the Jews deserve to be in their homeland, which is this area. Okay. But the mantra is it's something like a people without a land without people for a people without a land, saying that there was nobody there. And this mentality is pervasive in that radical side of that Israeli dogma, of this idea that this is our land, no one else should live here, this is ours, and whoever's here doesn't matter. Okay. And I'm not saying everybody feels this way. That's not the case. This is a radical. This is the radical side of this.
This is a Zionist.
The Zionist, the radical Zionists.
Okay.
And so when this happened, I mean, the Arabs that lived in the area that is Israel were completely displaced. They were all refugees. Yeah. So they were told to leave their house, leave their farms, leave everything they had behind. I mean, there are people who still are carrying the keys to their ancestral homes from when they had to leave. So this is a refugee crisis. This was a humanitarian crisis that was formulated, and then war broke out. So it was just compounded to be awful. So the Palestinian people were completely displaced from these areas, and this becomes a problem with everything going forward. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So in the 80s, there's this uprising for Palestinian nationalism, of the idea of a state of Palestine to resist the occupation. And my dad was a big part of that. And he fought with Yasser Arafat and the PLO
Oh, wow.
that violence was not the answer to this. That the only way to fight against the oppression is through nonviolence.
Okay.
Focusing on the work of Martin Luther King Jr. Seeing the civil rights movement, focusing on the Gandhi's work in India to remove the British from the control there. And it works. It does work, and it was working. And so they would do things like general strikes where all the Palestinian workers would just boycott complete days of the work they were supposed to do, because most of the time these were laborers that would work in Israel or in the West Bank, and they would just not work, or they would refuse to pay their taxes. Or one of the most beautiful things is they would plant olive trees in the farms and the fields where the Israeli settlements were starting to be built, or where Israel wanted to take over, because at the time there was a big the religious connotations of an olive tree was that you wouldn't uproot a fruit-bearing tree.
Okay.
And so they would plant olive trees so that this land couldn't be taken over.
Oh, wow.
And there were protests and there were boycotts, and he was in the center of all of it.
Wow.
And then in 1988, he was arrested and held in solitary confinement.
Whoa.
by the Israeli police.
How old are you at this time?
I was 10. So I was not quite 10 when he was arrested.
Okay.
It was actually right near my birthday when he was arrested.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're home in Ohio. Your dad's
I'm in Ohio.
Israel, gets arrested.
Yeah. And so he wasn't tortured and he wasn't hurt, because the first George Bush, President Bush, and James Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, intervened to protect him because he was an American citizen.
Okay. Wow.
So this was a big deal. I found out about it. I got a call from my relatives, and then I saw it on the news that night. So it was a big deal. And so whenever anybody says that the Palestinians have never wanted peace, or that they rejected, they always want violence and they're the terrorists, I say no. I have a direct link to someone who has done his entire life to fight for peace in the Middle East, and he's not the only one. But Israel he was dangerous. He was dangerous to the state of Israel. He was considered a threat to the state of Israel. And so they held him in solitary confinement, and then his case went to the Supreme Court, and they deported him on immigration charges. So they said because he was an American citizen, he outlasted his tourist visa, even though he was born there.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court upheld it, and he was deported back to the United States.
Okay.
So,
wow.
I still had 2 uncles and an aunt who lived over there.
Yeah.
Multiple cousins who were very active in the politics of the area.
Yeah.
And so we were still very connected, and he was still working with nonviolent movements across the Middle East. So then when the Oslo Accords, so I think like right around 1995, Clinton and Arafat and Rabin from Israel, they started to work on the Oslo Accords, which were another peace plan to work on a 2-state solution. And my dad was a part of those discussions. He helped spearhead that. And part of that was the PLO had to recognize the state of Israel, that Israel had to exist.
Okay.
And Israel had to work towards a Palestinian state and Palestinian sovereignty.
Okay.
And he helped work that out. And as soon as those were signed, he was allowed to go back.
Wow.
But never to live there, only as a tourist. They wouldn't let him live there.
Okay.
And so it was a really big deal. He got to go back, and now he can travel there. But it's the craziest thing, to be able to be told, you're a tourist in the place where you were born.
In your home, essentially your home.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
And so when I mentioned that there were a lot of sticky things that are part of this entire peace process, and you hear about all these starts and stops, and you hear about the violence on each side, and you hear about all this, and the people on the ground don't want this. I mean,
They don't want. Sorry, they don't want.
they like the general Israeli doesn't want occupation. It's awful. It's terrible.
They don't want to occupy places like Gaza Strip, the West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, they're an occupying power. They all have mandatory military service. There's a constant military presence around them. Even, you know, they've had to build walls. They're afraid. They've built the Iron Dome to protect themselves from homemade rockets. Like, this is their entire life is disrupted by this.
Yeah.
And the Palestinians, they want anything other than what they have right now, because they have nothing.
Okay.
So
how did we, Karim, sorry to interrupt, how did we get from the Oslo Accord, where both sides agree, 2 states, state of Israel and the state of Palestine? How did we get from the agreement, okay, this is going to happen, to Israel essentially occupying the whole area rather than there being 2 states? And again, I'm not implying that that Israel is necessarily at fault in that, and I'm also not going to imply that Palestine is at fault. And when I say those two, I mean, I don't know whether I'm saying the people or if I'm saying the governments, but yeah, I guess how did we get from that to where we are these days?
A series of bad decisions and anger. So there was hope. So during the Oslo Accords, the idea that the Palestinians were able to start to govern themselves, and this idea of a state of Palestine was formed. I mean, the idea had been around for a long time, but it had just kind of started.
Yeah.
But that was just an idea. And so they split the area into 3 different areas. So Gaza, the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
And then the West Bank was broken up into different areas. So Area A, which was Israeli controlled, but had Palestinian enclaves in it.
Okay.
Area B was joint control. Then Area C, which was all Palestinian control.
Okay.
So the West Bank was never not occupied. It was never the state of Palestine. So Gaza was and has been kind of dispersed and let alone.
Okay.
It's I mean, it is a walled, completely separated area, but it doesn't have these kind of joint areas.
Okay.
So what happened out throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even to this very day, Israel has incurred into the West Bank and built settlements.
They have physically gone in
and built cities.
Okay.
And they'll start with a small bunch of houses, and they build that up and build that up and build that up, and it becomes a city. And with that city, they have roads and they have infrastructure and they have everything that this normal city would. And then they've taken that land now. That's theirs. And if you look at a map of the West Bank, it looks like it looks kind of like, you know, a little bit like New Jersey, a little bit like a bean. The areas that are actually controlled by Palestine are about 165 different little islands within that.
Within there.
Everything else is completely disrupted by Israel and by settlements. So this idea that there's going to be a 2-state solution, which was a beautiful idea, was broken up and was dismantled, and it was done because of bad choices by the Palestinian Authority, infighting, looking for power. I mean, this is the first time they thought they had some kind of inkling of power, inkling of some kind of control, which was all just fake. It was all garbage. They thought they were being big leaders, and they didn't have any power, but they thought they did. And Israel just becoming more right wing and following this path of we're going to keep building settlements. No one can tell us what to do. We're going to take over this land. We're going to do this. This is ours. And the governments started to become divergent and make some really bad choices for the people. So when I say that the Palestinian state never really took off, it's because it was never a real thing. All the taxes that the Palestinian Authority collect goes to Israel. Israel controls all the money.
Okay.
Israel controls all the borders. Israel controls all natural resources. So there's not this idea of like, oh, the Palestinians should just stay in their area, just stay in the West Bank. It doesn't work that way.
They've been kicked out of the West Bank.
No, they're in the West Bank, but they're cut off.
Oh, they've been pushed aside.
Everything else, they've just, the land has been taken. If you look at some of the maps now, I mean, you'll see these little blotches of areas where they actually this area C of where this Palestinian control happens, and it's like Bethlehem and Ramallah and these cities. But you'll see other areas that are completely cut off. They're completely surrounded by Israeli-controlled areas, even within the West Bank.
Yeah.
And so one of the things with all these peace process and with all these discussions and all this back and forth, there's always there's some very thorny issues. And one of them is the right of return. So like I said, in 48, when Israel was formed, whole swaths of area were taken over by Israel and said, this isn't your land anymore, this is our land, and you have to get out. And the people who were there became refugees.
Yeah.
Some of them went to Lebanon, some of them went to Egypt, some of them went to Jordan, some of them went to other areas in the West Bank, or what was then the Palestinian territories. But they weren't in their home.
No.
And this idea that if a Palestinian state came back, the Palestinians should be able to return or go back, but there's no place for them to go. There's no land for them anymore. Their ancestral land, the land. I mean, like I said, people have keys, they have their deeds, they have this connection to this place, and it's gone. It's gone.
Yeah.
And so these refugees, they were never accepted into the countries they were in, like never accepted into Jordan, never accepted into Lebanon. Some of them didn't have citizenship there. Their kids might have, or subsequently they have. But they're not Lebanese, they're not Jordanian, these are Palestinians. They've just been displaced.
Huh.
And Israel will never let them return. That's something they can never do. And they won't, because they'll give up their land that they have now. And so that's going to be an issue that just never fully gets resolved. I mean, it will.
You've kicked people out of their homes.
Mm-hmm.
Other people are either living in the homes or on the land.
Yeah.
In different homes that have been built up.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is nowhere for them to come back to.
Right.
The neighborhood that they left actually doesn't physically exist anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
And even within the West Bank, there are refugee camps filled with Palestinians who are displaced, and families, generations now, who have lived there.
Sort of in the outskirts of these built up cities and neighborhoods
of these towns
that the Israel government has taken over.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of in the outskirts on land that maybe is not developed or whatever. That's sort of where these camps are. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a camp right in the middle of Bethlehem.
Wow.
Like fully controlled by Palestinians. It's a Palestinian city. It's part of the area controlled by the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
There's a refugee camp. It's right at the corner of the city.
Yeah.
So this type of thing just continually perpetuates anger and distrust between the two sides.
Yeah.
And then there'll be these flare-ups where Hamas or one of these violent groups will do something, will be ridiculous and try to fight.
Yeah.
And they're pathetic. They're absolutely pathetic. They have no power. They have no military. They have nothing. They're just radical militants, which just, and what they do is they act like they're tough. They throw these rockets, which is an awful atrocity. But then what they're throwing it at is one of the most powerful militaries in the world.
Yeah.
And then so that military goes, okay, cool. You don't have anything now. And now you're destroyed.
What?
So
Sorry,
that
go
that
ahead,
kind
finish
of
your thought. Yeah.
and then that breeds this distrust, and then that's exactly what's happening now. And this
Yeah.
is just it's been happening this way for decades.
Yeah. Why is there a vested interest? It seems not just America, but it seems that the Western world has a vested interest in specifically the state of Israel.
I think it's a few things.
Okay.
It's strategically important to have a foothold in the Middle East for the Western, or for like the United States and for Britain, and
Strategic from a military point.
militaristically, yeah, especially in the 70s. In the 70s, it was a really big deal when
Yeah.
the different Arab countries were becoming more powerful because of the oil.
Mm-hmm.
They were becoming more religious. There were democracies that were becoming quite, like Iran and Iraq were very progressive countries for a long time until they weren't.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different story with the meddling of the other countries. Saudi Arabia was always kind of, it was always a kingdom, but they started getting really wealthy. Kuwait started getting wealthy, the Emirates. And so they wanted a stronghold, and they didn't trust anybody else. And basically because of the Cold War, the Palestinians aligned themselves with Russia, which was another split, because the U.S. aligned themselves with Israel, and
Yeah.
the Palestine and the Arabs aligned themselves with Russia, which, you align yourself with losers and you get considered a loser, right? Like
Yeah.
that mentality is real.
Yeah.
I mean, and the other thing is, there's a very vocal, the Palestinian community wasn't always rallied as a group the way that the Jewish diaspora has been around the world.
Mm.
So the amount of the larger population in North America was more politically active, was more powerful, and spoke up for the rights and the strength of Israel. And I mean, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of guilt involved too, because of the atrocities that happened during World War II. And so no one wants to see that happen again, ever.
No one wants to see that happen to the Jewish people.
To anybody, but specifically for sure. And
But
I mean, that's a tragedy befit of nobody. No one should have that.
No, but I agree. So it boggles my mind, or one of the things that really confounds me is to see. So the last summer we were allowed to travel freely. Mm-hmm. We went to Eastern Europe for a few weeks. Mm-hmm. Great trip. Ended up going to Auschwitz. And I can't remember the name of the larger camp, not too far. It starts with a B. Birkenau, I think, something like that. I apologize, I don't remember the name. But just the as you're walking through that place, and you walk through the gas chambers, and you see where people were gassed and their bodies were burned, and you walk through other buildings there, and you see the thousands upon thousands of pairs of shoes left behind, and so on and so forth. And at that moment in time, you're thinking to yourself, how did we ever treat people like this? And then you sort of think of other things going on around the world that we're still treating people horribly.
Yeah.
And then when you think of what's happening in Israel, and you sort of you think back, okay, I can understand the unity that the Israelis have But
Mhm.
at the same time, you think about what they're doing to the Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip. It's like
Yeah.
you're doing the same thing that was done to you, essentially. And the world promised this wouldn't happen again, right? And
Yeah.
maybe like I don't know if those two are equal. I'm not saying they are or they're not, but it's almost like to me it seems like guys, you're doing the same thing,
Yeah.
you know.
I
And I'm
mean,
not saying things are like, you know, set in stone certain ways, right?
yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things where you'd really hope that that you wouldn't treat other people
Yeah.
that way. And it's there's no comparison, and there shouldn't ever be.
No.
There's, you know,
Yeah.
but you really need to see the actions in a light of, we've had atrocities done to us for so long. Just because we have some power now does not mean we should take it out on other people. We cannot use that power to do
Yeah.
this. And unfortunately, there's a group of uh, government, people in Israel who feel that, no, you know what, this is ours. We're going to take it. We're going to do whatever we can. We have to protect ourselves,
Yeah.
and we're going to do whatever we can to do that.
Yeah.
And when you have that mentality of righteousness and indignation based on your history, you'll do whatever you can and whatever you want. It doesn't matter who's in front of you.
Yeah.
And when you have the awful rhetoric that the worst of the Arabs say, of like, wipe Israel into the sea, and all this awful, awful, awful rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
that just gives them carte blanche.
Yeah.
And when Hamas shoots rockets, Israel's going to say, well, we need to defend ourselves. And the way they defend themselves is by destroying entire neighborhoods.
Yeah.
With pinpoint accuracy. Like this,
Yeah.
this isn't a joke. These are like, this is military attack helicopters and warplanes and advanced military equipment versus like hospitals and children. And this idea that, but Hamas is using human shields and all that stuff, and that's all complete garbage on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to absolve the violence that's been happening, but it's not true. And I can't say it never happened. It has never happened or anything like that. But when schools and hospitals are destroyed, when journalists are arrested, when areas are leveled, when apartment buildings are destroyed, when infrastructure is destroyed, this isn't an accident. This isn't some kind of joke. This isn't like, oh, whoops. No, it doesn't work that way. And this just perpetuates that entire cycle of violence.
Yeah.
So what happened recently, where not only have settlers begun to be extremely violent in the West Bank and started to take over more land and go into the Palestinian areas and burn fields and harass and violently attack Palestinians. In East Jerusalem, the police and the defense force, the IDF, started to take over houses.
Yeah.
They started to take over land again, and they just kick out, boot, arrest, and dispossess the Palestinians off their land again, and it still happens. And so then you get Hamas, who thinks they're big and tough, and they think they're going to do something big, and then you see the numbers of casualties, and it's completely disproportionate because the power is disproportionate.
Yeah.
The Palestinians don't have any power, and so they fight back as a militia.
Yeah.
And I don't believe in violence on either side. Yeah. Hamas is insane. They're ridiculous. But Israel is as well. And Israel is the occupying force. Israel is the power.
Yeah.
The Palestinians don't have any power.
Yeah.
Israel has the power. And it's their responsibility to not do that right now.
Yeah.
So the idea that there's a right and a wrong that's not an answer to any of this. There is what is right and what is wrong. And both sides are doing things that are right, and both sides are doing things that are wrong.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for the people, especially the Palestinian people, they are on the wrong side of those numbers, of all of the numbers.
Yeah.
And that's where the trouble lies right now.
Huh. What? So you have visited many times.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the last time you went, and what was it like? What was it like? Where did you go?
Yeah, last time it was before my kids were born, so I guess it would have been
Okay.
8 or 9 years ago.
Okay.
Um, it was the first time I had been back since they built the separation wall between Israel and the West Bank, and it
Okay.
was terrifying, frankly terrifying.
Why
So
did you go?
I went with to show my wife,
Oh wow.
to
Okay.
visit my family. We actually traveled with a couple other friends. We were in Egypt for a bit, and then we went into Jordan, and then from Jordan into Palestine and Israel,
Okay.
and spent time in Bethlehem and Jerusalem
Scary.
primarily. So no, I mean, well, yeah. So crossing into Israel,
Yeah.
I had to coach our friends and my wife, like, and Christy, I had to coach them on what to do, because I'd been back and forth quite a bit, and every single time I'm detained every single time. I'm questioned, I'm harassed every single time.
Because of your dad.
Yeah.
Your name, your dad.
My name, my dad, everything.
Yeah.
So I had to coach them. I said, look, you guys go ahead. You say you are going to the Bethlehem Bible College, which was true. That's what my uncle has started, the Bethlehem Bible College. We were staying there. You're going to be visiting Jerusalem and the holy sites around Bethlehem and Jerusalem. That's what you say.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll meet you on the other side.
Yeah.
And Christy, this is what you say. And you stay over here when they
Yeah.
take me away.
Yeah.
And invariably they did. So
Hmm.
I go up, I say my name. They ask me ridiculous questions about my
Yeah.
religion, about
Yeah.
everything about that.
Yeah.
They say, okay, hold on. Then they bring over some people with guns, and they take you into a room and ask you questions, and they detain you.
Yeah.
And I answer questions. I have a smile on my face. I answer the questions politely. I don't back down.
Yeah.
And then eventually they let me go.
You
Every
also
single
don't
time.
you also don't tell them your views either, right? You know, like, by the way.
No. The last time, so then we ended up traveling again, and we went down in Christy and I went back out into Jordan and then back in, and went to a different crossing point. This was down in Elat in southern Israel.
Yeah.
And this crossing was different. It was very open. It was in the middle of open area.
Yeah.
It was just like there was a series of gates that we had to go through. And Christy they pushed her through.
Okay.
And she could see me in the area that I was kind of being questioned at. And there were 2 guards and then another woman who was like the sergeant or whatever. And she was maybe 5'2", 5'3". And so I stood up, and I stood, not aggressively, but I stood up, and I stood over her with a big smile on my face, gentle and nice. But she's like, "Oh, could you sit down?" I was like, No, I'd like to stand. I was sitting all day. I'd like to stand. And I'm just above her.
Yeah.
And with a nice, not aggressive, just I am bigger than you, and you are not going to talk down to me.
Yeah.
Oh, and they asked me ridiculous questions about, what's my religion? Okay, I'm Christian. Okay, well, tell me about the saints. And I was like, oh, I'm not that kind of Christian. I'm not Catholic. I'm Protestant. Oh, what's that mean? Okay. What does your wife do? I was like, oh, she's a nurse. Oh, does she know science? I was like, yeah, she did a science degree. Well, I thought she said she was a nurse. She did both. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
this type of thing. And it's meant to, it's meant for their security is what they're looking for.
Yeah.
But they do it in a way that's demeaning, and I get it. And I was never in danger. I was never scared.
Yeah.
I have an American passport. I have a Canadian passport. I'm not worried about this.
Yeah.
And then you see the families go through who are trying to, see go back home or go see loved ones or whatever, if they even get the chance to leave.
Yeah.
This is pure terror in their eyes.
Yeah.
And this is the international crossing. Like, this is into Israel.
Yeah.
But the border wall, which they've created, is like a prison. You walk through and there's tiny pathways, all with fence around them, and there's huge guard towers with machine guns and with armored soldiers all around you. And you walk through this like you're in jail. And they say next, and you go up. They yell at you in Hebrew. You don't speak Hebrew. They say, "Hey, I speak English." Let's talk to you in English. Just constant threat of harassment. And then once you're through, that's going from Jerusalem into Bethlehem. Once you're through and into Bethlehem, and you don't look at the wall, you see Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel, and then I feel comfortable.
Wow.
Then I'm okay. Because there's no military presence. I don't see the military.
Yeah.
I don't see guns. I don't see violence. I don't see the wall.
Yeah.
So that the occupation as an oppressive force is real. I mean, it is real. Like we don't hear about that here. I mean, everything that goes in or out of the West Bank. This isn't even Gaza. Gaza is a whole different story. Gaza is a disaster. But everything that goes into West Bank,
Yeah.
every good, any money, travel, anything. You want to go overseas? You can't. There's no. You don't leave from the West Bank. There's no place to go. You have to go into Israel, and then they decide if you get to go someplace. Everything in your life is controlled. Everything. And that's a terrible thing for the Palestinians, and it's a terrible thing for the Israelis. It's awful.
Because Palestine, they're not necessarily citizens, are they?
There's no citizen. Yeah, there's no citizenship. You can have your Palestinian citizenship, I guess, but it doesn't mean anything. And if you're an Arab Israeli or a Palestinian in Israel,
yeah,
you're treated as a second-class citizen. You don't have the full complements of rights. It's close. You have rights and stuff, and you can move around and work and stuff, but you're never treated the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, we hear about there's wonderful things in Israel. Their technology scene is incredible. They're high tech.
Yeah.
You're in Tel Aviv. It's like you're in any of the modern cities in Europe. There's a pride parade in Tel Aviv. There are, wonderful freedoms. But right next door, there's oppression. There's racism. There's just flat out violence. And so at the cost of this freedom that they have and this modernity that they possess is with a boot on the neck of the Palestinians. And it's nothing you can deny. Like, this is the other thing, is that it's a hard truth, similar to the way it was in South Africa. The apartheid was a hard truth that the South Africans had to finally rationalize. Same thing as in Israel. They've created as close to an apartheid state as you can get now.
And the longer this goes on, it's like the harder to release, because it's almost like like all that pressure needs to go somewhere.
That's right.
And so if you release that oppression, that pressure then comes up. I'm guessing that's sort of, it's like a catch-22.
That's right. It's terrifying. And there can't be a single state, because Israel won't exist, because there's more Palestinians than there are Israelis. And that's why
I did not know that. Okay.
That's why Israel welcomes anyone of Jewish heritage to be Israeli. Everybody can come back. They have the right of return for themselves, but they have displaced. Whether
or not you're from there,
right?
You can go there and be a citizen.
Yeah, but if they said right now, okay, you know what, we're done with occupation.
Yeah.
Everybody in Palestine, come on, we're going to let you be Israeli.
Yeah.
If you want it, you can vote, you can do everything. The first vote, they'll lose. They won't have, their prime minister won't be Israeli. It won't be Jewish, because they don't have the numbers.
Which is why,
So they can't do it. So they have to oppress to keep the status quo.
Yeah.
And they can't, there's no such thing as a two-state solution, because the land doesn't allow it anymore. It's been broken up so much. There's no connection between Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, it's literally a
It's
desert.
weird.
Like,
Like, I don't know. Like, how did that happen? Can you explain to me how that happens? It's almost like the only thing I can think of is Pakistan and Bangladesh,
mhm.
right? On
Yep,
different sides of India,
yep, very similar.
right? It's like
Very similar.
I don't profess to know the history of India-Pakistan relations,
Yeah.
but my understanding is that India predominantly Hindu,
Mhm,
Pakistan, Bangladesh predominantly Muslim.
mhm.
Um, is that he said like they just sort of pushed them aside?
No, it goes back to the original wars when Egypt occupied that area and Jordan occupied
Okay,
the West Bank. So it
okay,
goes back to that.
okay.
Gaza and Gaza City, and like, there's it's a incredibly densely populated area, and so I've only been there once
To Gaza.
to Gaza, and it took us like 4 hours to get in before they let us in, and we went in to meet the Palestinian Authority, and is a that's an area that's on the water. You'd think there should be beaches, there should be a port, there should be all these things. None of that exists. You're allowed to go in the water, but there's flotillas. You can't go past a certain area. Fishing boats can't go past a certain area.
Oh, there's
No,
like a
no, there's no
Israeli Navy.
transportation. Yeah, there's no transportation out of there. There's nothing out of there. This was even during, this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, before the siege, which completely shut it down. And it's now, I mean, it's called the world's largest open air prison for a reason. Nothing goes in or out. There's no freedoms outside of it.
When you
Um,
say nothing goes in and out, are you like being very literal? Like nothing goes in, like you can't import or export?
so okay, that's you're right. I'm being hyperbolic. Nothing
No, no,
goes in or
no.
out without Israeli say so.
Okay.
If the Israelis don't want food to go in, food won't go in. If Israelis don't want water to go in, water doesn't go in. Now there are mechanisms in the southern area where Egypt has found a way, and there's supposed to be a gate that's open, but that's all still controlled. There's still Israeli presence right there, and if they want to shut that down, they just bomb the hell out of it, and then it's done. There's no freedom there.
Hmm.
So when you watch the news and you see the apartment buildings getting destroyed, or you see hospitals or the roads or just bombs falling, to repair those, you can repair those when Israel lets the stuff go through. You can have medical supplies when Israel lets that stuff go through. Everything's controlled.
So even like I've been reading recently that there's like UN buildings, I don't know if they're hospitals or schools or
Mhm.
whatnot. Israel even controls that stuff, like what the UN can take in.
Yeah, any of the aid organizations, any of the United Nations things, any of the journalists,
Yeah.
anything.
Wow.
And so when you hear that there's this conflict going on, that there's these fighting, that the way that we talk about it is that they're even sides, and
Mm.
that there is there it could not be further from the truth. These are
Yeah.
not even sides. It's not like the Leafs versus the Habs on even level footing. There's nothing. It's not like that.
Yeah.
It'd be like a junior Pee Wee hockey team playing against the Leafs.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not the Leafs, but a good team. No, I guess the Leafs are good now, so I can't make that joke.
Yeah.
But
No, I understand.
there's no comparison there,
Yeah.
and we talk about it as if there is, and
Mhm.
there's Palestinian leaders who act like there is, and there's just not. And there's not a sense of equality um, at all. And so when these third party brokered peace plans get created, or there's these ideas that, oh well, this is what you need to do, it's very unilateral. It's not addressing what the core issue is that there's no equality, there's no justice in these decisions. It's, you should take this because this is what we're giving to you, Palestinians. This is all that you get now.
Yeah.
You've lost. Here, have these things. Oh, you don't like that? Well, then you don't want to be part of the peace process. You don't want this. There's no reconciliation there.
Yeah.
And there can't be justice and peace without that reconciliation, without that almost atonement, without that, okay, we need to restart this. And that doesn't exist in the current governments of either Palestine or sorry, the leadership, not even governments, the leadership of Palestine or Israel. So these there's no real solutions because the radicals on each side continue to destroy any of the trust. And so when you hear people in North America and you hear people say, oh, well, if you're against Israel, you're anti-Semitic. That's one of the most dangerous types of rhetoric you can hear. Because that could not be further from the truth. And as soon as somebody says that, the discussion and the communication is done. Because if you think that the people who are talking to you hate you, you're not going to listen to them. You're not going to be altruistic to them. You're not going to help them.
Yeah.
And you can absolve all the violence that you're perpetrating on them. Because, well, they hate me, so let's just destroy them.
Yeah.
And so when anybody says that, they're right back to square one. And it's an awful thing. Anti-Semitism could not be it's a terrible thing, as any racism is.
Yeah.
But when it's used as a validation and as a reason to not listen to somebody or to hate somebody or to perpetuate occupation of a people.
So there's one thing to be,
it's used as violence.
There's one thing to be what's what I'm looking for, to disagree with what the state of Israel is doing.
Yep.
One can be against that and disagree with the occupation tendencies of Israel, but at the same time not be anti-Semitic, because that's two different things. One is about a state and a government. The other is about Jewish people.
Correct. They've conflated it, and a lot of that has been conflated.
Yeah.
And it's been, and so if the human rights atrocities in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia and Iran, like these are awful states.
Yeah.
Their governments are terrible.
Yeah.
But does that make me Islamophobic? No one would ever say that.
Yeah.
No one would ever say that.
Yeah.
And I will rail against the atrocities in Saudi Arabia. I will rail across about the atrocities in the Arab world against foreign people, against the foreign workers in Qatar when they're building these World Cup stadiums.
Yeah.
And more people have died than we even know about. These are atrocities.
Yeah.
But does anybody say that I'm Islamophobic? No.
Yeah.
Because they don't conflate the two. It's not aligned.
Yeah.
And when the radical Israeli sect says, well, you're either with us or against us, you're either for Israel or you're not, what they've done is they've completely isolated themselves into a no-win situation.
Yeah.
Because that's not the case. That's like if you say something against the Canadian government, you're not Canadian anymore.
Yeah.
That's not how democracy works.
No,
that's not how any of this works.
Yeah.
And so when that gets taught, that's hate getting taught,
and
it's fear getting taught. And there are some wonderful Israeli peace organizations and some real Israeli, loud voices for human rights, for freedom and for justice, for everybody, and especially for the Palestinians. They are loud voices, and those voices are getting louder. And those voices are getting more prominent.
Are they? Okay.
And it's a wonderful thing to see, because they can't keep living this way. These are people in Israel who cannot do this to people. They see the pain that it's causing, not only the Palestinians, but the pain it's causing to Israelis. Because Israelis suffer too.
Yeah.
And there's, I'm a new Canadian. I'm proudly a new Canadian, but I hear about the atrocities which the Canadian government has done on the Indigenous people here,
Mhm.
and it bothers me to my core.
Of course, yeah. And so the
So
same thing is
course.
happening there in
Of
Israel.
course. If that doesn't bother you to your core, then don't talk to me about human rights. Look, there's a picture of a Israeli Defense Force soldier kneeling on the neck of a Palestinian person, just like George Floyd.
A year ago.
Just like that.
Yeah.
And that happens daily. And that vitriol and that anger and that fear that we all should feel and felt, seeing that and hearing that and seeing the pain in that entire population. But then to turn around and say, "Oh, it's okay though."
Yeah.
Because this group can do it.
Do you think it's because of the history that the Jewish people have had to endure, the painful history that they've had to endure, that it almost, I don't want to say anything more, but it's almost like we've been stepped on and had other people put their boots in our neck for so long. We're just fighting back.
We're defending ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. But that's not, I don't believe in that justification.
But like you said, it does two wrongs don't make a right.
Just as I would not believe in that same justification when Hamas says it, Hezbollah says it, Iran says it, anybody.
Yeah.
That's complete and utter nonsense and garbage. Reconciliation and equality and justice is the only way forward. And it's so much more difficult.
It's so much because you've already illustrated why Israel will never go for a one-state solution. Yeah. In terms of, like, it already is technically one state, but in terms of a proper, everyone is equal one-state solution. Yeah. Two-state solution, you're saying now there's nowhere to go, right? There is no more homes for unless all of these Jewish families and neighborhoods that are now in the West Bank and leave.
The settlements, yeah, but new ones are being built all the time. I mean, they're just straight up taking the land away, like they did in East Jerusalem. Sheikh Jarrah. That's exactly what this was all about. And even the night of the ceasefire, one of the holiest during Ramadan, the last days of Ramadan.
Yeah.
Palestinians celebrating the ceasefire at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest places in Islam. Israel stopped the celebration. The police forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tear gassed, skunk watered, pepper sprayed, rubber bullets. Why? There's no violence against them. There's no violence. It's just that you can't have that.
Yeah.
That type of stuff, and this is generational now. And so those kids that are seeing that grew up with nothing but that. It's not justified anger, but they're angry. So it's an atrocity. It's lost generations continuing to lose. And so, to be honest, there has to be a one-state solution. There has to be. But Israel needs to exist. Israel needs to exist. There needs to be a safe and secure area for anybody in that area. Jew, Christian, Muslim, Sufi, the Bedouins who are persecuted by all sides. It needs to be a place to exist, and it needs to be safe and secure for everybody, and everybody needs to have those equal rights.
That's the
So secure the state of Israel.
Yeah.
The state of Israel should exist.
Yeah.
It should not be a religious state. It should be a state that is welcoming to
Anyone.
Palestinians and Israelis alike,
Yeah.
with free and full rights. Look, this is where my
How does
naive
that? How does that?
this is where
Yeah.
it breaks for me, because I've never been under the oppression. I never
Yeah.
have. I visited and I've been oppressed while I've been there, but I've never
Yeah.
lived in that.
You've had the opportunity to leave.
I've had the opportunity to leave.
You've got the American
But-
passport.
Right. But I have to believe that just because I live in Israel as a Palestinian, that doesn't make me not a Palestinian. So having the freedoms and having the ability to live a life
Yeah.
as a Palestinian in the land of Israel and Palestine would be is the solution. To get there, it's nearly, I mean, it's almost impossible to think about.
It seems to have worked. Like, no, I don't think there is a place that is perfect, but it seems to have worked in South Africa.
Yeah.
Right. It is one state. There is not there's no two states or
Right.
two different countries in South Africa. It is one
Mhm.
country.
And I think one of the big differences there is while religion plays a part in all of that, it's not the prominent driving force.
Yeah.
When
You're right.
religion takes over, it's a belief. It's not, and you can absolve all manners of crime with
Yeah.
religion.
Yeah.
And so when you look at it as a racial issue, like it was in South Africa, it's very easy to see the evil, very easy to see the injustice, because racism based on the color of your skin is just flat out wrong.
Yeah.
That there's no Israeli who would doubt that. They shouldn't. Not a good Israeli, not a good Palestinian, not a good Arab.
Yeah.
But when religion comes into play, it messes everything up. Now, I'm not saying, look, I'm not denouncing religion. What I'm saying is that when you mix a state with religion, and you dictate who is in and who's out based on that religion, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
It always has been.
Everywhere.
Everywhere it has been a disaster.
Yeah.
And so when you use that, when you weaponize that against the people who are against you, or use it as a shield to protect yourself, you're doing that in a place in a state of violence, to be honest. You're using your religion as a weapon.
Have you thought about how you get from where we are to a state, a country that is cosmopolitan, that is democratic, that is, I'm not saying that it is perfect, but it is a place where everyone can work and do what they want. They can study, they can travel in and out, they can travel internally, they can vote. Like, how do you get from where we are to that?
You first and foremost agree on the humanity of the person across the table. You look across and you say, my Jewish cousin, which they're all cousins, my Israeli friend, you deserve to live and to exist and to be free.
Yeah.
And they in turn look to the Palestinians, look to the Arabs and say, you deserve to exist, you deserve to be free. And there's going to be radicals, there's going to be terrorists on both sides, as there always are.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be easy to get past that. But the moment that happens, and the moment you can see a picture of Bethlehem and a picture of Hebron and a picture of East Jerusalem and compare that to West Jerusalem and compare Tel Aviv and this modern metropolis of shiny, beautiful, modern city to the backwards kind of third world area in Palestine. And you say, no, this isn't okay. We need to make this equal.
Yeah.
And we need to tear down the separation wall. I mean, and by taking these steps, you're removing the radicals. Hamas has no say in anything if the Palestinian people have what they need. Hamas has control and has power because they give back to the Palestinian people. It's a lot like in the old areas of New York where the mob took over.
Yeah.
And if you wanted anything, you had to go to the mob because no one else would help you.
Yeah.
It's the same exact thing. It's because they're without. They found somebody who has some way to give them something.
Yeah.
And then the radical Israelis, they won't have a say. They're pushed to the side too. Because they're going to be the violent oppressors. There's no defending your land when no one's trying to take it away from you.
Yeah.
It completely it takes away all of their power. And I'm making this sound extremely easy. I'm not trying to be glib about this. I'm just saying that that's the process. And that same thing happened in South Africa. The warlords in the townships and the incredibly racist government. The moment you take those away, what are they fighting for? And I'm not saying that that's completely clean and that was perfect or anything. I'm just saying that you take away that power from the radical groups, and the people begin to be able to can begin to heal.
We can hope.
I mean, that's the most dangerous thing, is that hope continues to erode. With every new settlement that gets built, with every rocket that gets thrown from Hamas, when every child who gets buried under rubble in Gaza, when every rock gets thrown at a settler, when every settler shoots a Palestinian, where every single thing, it's such a fragile thing.
Yeah.
As we saw, right? I mean, land was taken away. Palestinians rose up and protested.
Mm-hmm.
Israeli police and the IDF stormed them. Hamas said, we're going to defend them. It's just, you can see this escalation happen.
Yeah.
And, we took that land because of this. And, you did that because of this. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can always go back to history.
Yeah.
Always. So if
sooner or later you have to decide to stop.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I see it. I see it in Twitter. I see, people saying I'm with Israel in one tweet, and the next tweet they're like, Black Lives Matter. Oppression's oppression. But one is your oppression, one's another person's oppression. That's just not okay. I mean, then you see the entirely insane people who blame Jews and blame everything. Like that's garbage too. It's just, so all that rhetoric doesn't help anything.
No.
So when you lean on the past and you lean on history to the point of holding back the progress, it's a disaster. I mean, you might to the Palestinian family who has their deed and they have their key to that house, it's not your house anymore. It's a tragedy. It's a disaster, but that's not your house anymore.
Yeah.
You should be allowed to be back in Palestine, in Israel. You should have the ability to go back and make a life for yourself on that land.
Build a future.
Build a new home, build a future.
Yeah.
But that key doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
It's lost. And it was lost by the poor decisions of Yasser Arafat. It was lost by the governments of Israel. It was lost every step of the way, and it's a disaster, and it's horrible. And both
Yeah.
sides have horrible
Both,
disasters in the entire way up and down.
both sides have been at fault.
Yeah,
And both sides need to look in the mirror
100%.
and decide. Yeah, it can't be one side saying, here's how it's going to be. It needs to be, let's shake hands.
Yeah.
We've messed up. We've killed each other's families. But if we don't change, we'll continue to kill each other's families.
Yeah, and unfortunately, right now for the Palestinian people, they're losing more.
Yeah.
Because they have no power. And so when I say that, I know what I'm saying. I'm not blaming Israel for that. And these are just the facts on the ground.
Yeah.
More Palestinians are killed.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that the Israelis who are killed are worth any less, or that that's okay, because it's not. It's a disaster every single time.
Yeah.
But there's one side that has power here. And so and that's okay to acknowledge. It's okay. I'm not saying anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
That's not to absolve the Palestinian Authority. That's not to absolve Hamas. That's not to absolve the radicals, the violence that happens. I'm not absolving any of that. But there's one side that has power.
What your dad still works for peace?
Every day.
Still very active?
Extremely. Yeah. He teaches up until recently. He's been teaching nonviolent resistance at American University in Washington, D.C. He still runs Nonviolence International, a group focused on international nonviolent action.
Yeah.
Still works with many Palestinian and Israeli groups to promote peace. Before the pandemic, he was teaching a class in Haifa with one of his good friends, Eddie Kaufman, who's a Jewish professor, and him as a Palestinian professor. They taught a joint class on nonviolence and peace. So I'm constantly amazed at his ability to be hopeful.
Yeah.
In the face of everything he's gone through, in the face of losing his father, of being separated from his family, of being deported from his homeland, not being able to live there. Still, he has hope. He sees something worth fighting for.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
How is your family in back in Israel and Palestine?
It's tough. So my uncle, one of my uncles, he lives in Beit Jala, which is just outside of Bethlehem. As I said, he started the Bethlehem Bible College, which still exists. They're doing okay. I spoke with them recently. It's not great.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have a pandemic there too, and they can't leave, and they can't leave 2 times now. One of my uncles just left Jerusalem and moved to Oregon to be with with my cousin. I have 2 cousins who live there now. So he left, him and his wife, my aunt. I have my cousin. It runs the Holy Land Trust, which is a group in Bethlehem working for peace. Relatives of ours live in between Jordan and Jerusalem. The Kutab family, which is my grandma's family, we're still very close with them.
Yeah.
Daoud Kutab is a journalist, and Jonathan Kutab goes back and forth, and he's a prominent lawyer working on Palestinian and Israeli rights.
Wow.
So I used to ask them. I said, like how I don't understand how this works. Like why is everybody so involved? And they always kind of said, just it's a small pond. Not that they were big fish. It's just that the pond was small.
Yeah.
So I'm extremely proud of my family. And like I said, whenever anybody says, "Oh, the Palestinians never fought for peace," where is their voice for peace? There's always a voice for peace.
Yeah.
It's just if you want to hear it, there's always a voice for peace.
Oh man, I could talk to you for so long, but
Man, I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for the conversation.
no, this has been. I can't believe I've known you for so long, and I didn't know hardly any of this about your family. Maybe I did, but I didn't pay attention.
I mean, look, it unfortunately it comes up in fits and starts. Like my Twitter feed right now is not a very fun place to be. You know, it's not. I'm posting.
I like your Twitter feed.
I'm posting stuff on the ground. I mean, I mix that in with some jokes and stuff like that. But
yeah,
you know, there's I'm always up for this kind of conversation.
Yeah.
I never want to shut the door on these kind of discussions. And you know, if an Israeli or if a friend of ours who's Jewish, or if anybody wants to talk about this, I'm here to talk about it, and I'm here to learn about it. Right? I don't know what it's like to have your family wiped out in the Holocaust, and then live in an area that is constantly under threat or potential threat. And I've never had to shift that mindset into from victim to powerful. I've never had to shift that mindset. That must be an insane identity crisis. That must be an insanely difficult thing to do. Yeah. I have nothing but empathy towards that. But when we have these kind of conversations, I mean, this is we speak with what we know, and you know, it's important. It's important stuff to talk about. It really is.
I would love to speak to your dad. I feel I'm prepared and I'm comfortable.
All right, we can make that happen.
Yeah. Please make an email introduction.
Yeah, I'd love to. He'll like your name, if nothing else.
If nothing else, I've got that going for me. Oh man, Karim, man, thanks so much for this, buddy. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. You know, anytime you want to talk about anything, you know, I'm here for you. On the 400th episode, I'll be here.
Oh man, this has been awesome. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, thank you.